Hello, good afternoon. Today, our guest is Professor Robert Jensen. Hello, Professor Jensen. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing fine because I'm a retired professor, so life is good.
Yes, Professor Jensen, I read your interview published by Countercurrents, and it is excellent. I read all of it.
Well, thank you.
Yes, I know people really serious people don't like to be flattered, but it was a really awesome interview. And what I like about the interview is that you and the interviewer touched on many controversial topics, but they
Mhm.
were handled with such maturity, quite
Ah,
unusual in our present climate. So you are speaking to a writer who doesn't really take ideas like toxic masculinity all that serious, but your explanations were erudite and it was quite respectful. So we're going to start with a contentious topic, toxic
okay.
masculinity. Women are not perfect. A writer for a real magazine, a young woman wrote an excellent piece criticizing feminism and what she calls toxic femininity. Women are not imperfect. Women are imperfect like men, but yet we don't refer to women as toxic. We refer to men as toxic. In America today, the average recipient of a PhD is a woman. In Jamaica, I live in Jamaica, more girls than boys are enrolled in school at the primary level and at the university level. In America, there's a growing debate and it's being promoted by people on both the left and the right that our boys are falling behind in school, and not just in America, but in the developed world more broadly. And secondly, boys receive harsh punishments for similar offenses when compared to female students. And in Jamaica, when the victim of an abuse is a boy, people are less likely to report it. But we don't seem to be expressing sympathy to men, but we talk a lot about toxic masculinity. So what is toxic masculinity and should we take it seriously?
Well, I don't use the phrase toxic masculinity. I talk about masculinity in patriarchy. So I always think it's best to go back to the nature of the system out of which particular social practices emerge. And in this case, we're talking about patriarchy, which is the term we've used for a long time now for a system of institutionalized male dominance. A lot of people think patriarchy is, part of human history forever, but it's not. It's actually a fairly recent phenomenon in human history. The history of patriarchy goes back at most 6,000 years. And of course, the human species has been around Homo sapiens for 200 to 300,000 years. So patriarchy is a recent development in which men, originally in the family, but eventually in broader societies, uh, assert control over women. That's what we're talking about. And in such a system, lots of things that become so-called normal for male behavior are in fact quite destructive, male violence being the most obvious one. Now, all the things you mentioned, right, the problems that boys have, I think are important to highlight. And they're also a product of patriarchy. So take the fact that, men have higher rates of suicide, men are victims of violence. Well, what is the source of that? It's the competition within patriarchy that leads men to not only act out violently, especially sexually violently against women, but it leads them to act out against each other that way. It's what I called in a book I wrote, King of the Hill masculinity. It's a social system in which everybody is always striving for dominance. Well, not everybody can be in a dominant position. So in patriarchy, men, as a rule, exert that kind of power over women, but men also vie for each other with power. Now, when you add into that white supremacy and enduring patterns of racism, you add in economic inequality in this system, in capitalism, right? You have pathologies in different systems that combine in different ways. But none of that is a critique of feminism from my point of view, although there are versions of feminism today I don't agree with. But I always think, let's go back to the systems: white supremacy, capitalism, imperialism, the dominance of the first world over the developing world, and at the core, patriarchy. And then you start to see how all of these pathological outcomes happen. Women are not the only people who suffer in the world, quite obviously, but no feminist would ever argue that.
Professor Jensen, you note that patriarchy is quite you earlier in the interview said that patriarchy occurred quite early in human history.
No,
Could
I said it's quite recent in human history.
quite recent, sorry, not early,
Yeah.
quite recent in human history. Sorry about that.
Mhm.
But that argument is a bit contentious because there are several writers, even going back to the early anthropologists like Morgan and some of their successors, people in the 21st century, who argue that the origins of patriarchy are biological and patriarchy is not actually recent in human history. So what would you say to these people?
I think they're wrong. Their reading of the evidence is wrong. First of all, to say it's biological is in some sense a tautology. Everything humans do in some sense is biological, right? We don't do things that are outside of our nature. That's why I can't step outside and fly, right? It's not in the nature of the human organism to fly. So whether something is biological or not, I think is a bit of a red herring. But I think the best reading of the evidence, the archaeological, anthropological evidence, is that institutionalized male dominance has not been a part of the human experience. In fact, dominance in general has not been part of the human experience until very recently. I think it's important to take the long view, and let's take that 200 to 300,000 years of human history of the existence of the species Homo sapien. Well, up until about 10 or 12,000 years ago, every human who ever lived in a gathering and hunting society. We were a foraging species. And with very few exceptions, most of those human societies in our foraging history were small. They were largely mobile. They were what we anthropologists would call band level, right? And they had very little hierarchy. There was very little institutionalized dominance, whether it was around sexual difference or racial difference or anything else. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't exceptions to that or it's not a complex history. But in fact, what we take to be normal today, which is the assumption that somebody or some group will be dominant over another person or another group, that is not the experience of most of human history. Those systems of domination and subordination, we've been speaking mostly about patriarchy, but there are others, of course, those don't emerge in human history till after the invention of agriculture, which is 10 to 12,000 years ago. That led to most of what we now call civilization, but also it led to a whole lot of what I think we should call uncivilized behavior, the barbarism of the last few thousand years of human history. So, people in every discipline, whether it's anthropology or anything else, argue. But I think the overwhelming evidence in history and anthropology is that these systems of domination are fairly recent. The book I refer people to is called The Creation of Patriarchy by a really extraordinary historian, sadly now passed, named Gerda Lerner.
Yes, I'm familiar with her.
Yeah, one of the first people to actually ask the question, where does patriarchy come from? And her book is fascinating.
Gerda Lerner. Another Professor Johnson, there's also another argument in relation to patriarchy. So the evidence is quite clear. So if you Google patriarchy or the evolution of patriarchy, you're going to see many articles linking it to agriculture. But there's also an argument that even in societies where status is not dependent on exploiting other people or agricultural dominance, men are still more dominant than women.
Well, first of all, I don't think that holds as a pattern. I think we have to distinguish between sex-based differences in human cultures and sex-based differences leading to dominance. So if you look at those foraging societies I talked about, you'll see sex-based differences, which are inevitable in human societies because women carry and nurse babies and men don't. So inevitably, there will be differences in how we organize human societies. So for instance, in foraging societies, again, there are a lot of complexity and nuance to this, but as a general rule, it was true that women tended to do the majority of the gathering of plant food, and that men did most of the big game hunting, although women also do small game hunting. And there are biological reasons for that. Okay, well, that doesn't mean that man, the hunter, was dominant. That's kind of the cartoon version of it. First of all, you have to recognize that the majority of calories in those foraging societies came typically from gathering, not hunting. So hunting wasn't the central practice to feed people, right? And you also can look at societies and see that there were lots of ways power was shared between men and women. But you also have to remember, we're talking about band level societies, rarely over 100 people. And they didn't have surpluses. Before agriculture, there was very little surplus in human experience, only in a few resource-rich areas, like where there was a salmon run that was incredibly productive, let's say. But for most of human history, there was no surplus. And when there's no surplus and no way to store what little surplus there might be, the fact is you don't have much to fight over. Right? Now, that doesn't mean human beings were somehow angelic. I mean, we're a pretty nasty creature capable of being mean-spirited and violent. And that's been true throughout human history. But one of the interesting things about foraging societies is they also had social customs to try to damp down the arrogance and hubris that is possible in humanity. In other words, there were customs by which you tried to keep people from thinking too much of themselves, for getting a big head, you might say. So again, human history is complex, but the patterns, I think, are quite easy to identify. And those patterns, I think, do start, the patterns of hierarchy, of domination and subordination, do emerge largely after the invention of agriculture. That's where you get the production of surpluses that can be stored, and therefore ownership of those surpluses becomes something worth fighting for. From there, you get, village life, you get settled life, you get empires, you get the kind of barbarism of human history that we're all familiar with going back, several thousand years now.
Robert, early in the conversation, when I said dominant, more than likely I made an error. I should have actually said influence. Influence and dominance are two different verbs. When we say dominant, we're usually connoting some form of exploitation, but the appropriate word is influence, male influence. How do we explain male influence? That's how I should have posed the question earlier.
Sure, and the one thing we have to remember is human societies eventually expanded to virtually every part of the planet, with the exception of Antarctica, right? And geography, climate, the environmental conditions will shape those human societies, so there'll be a lot of variation. And so you can have societies in which, as I said, there is gender role differentiation. That is, men and women play different roles in society. But it doesn't mean dominance. Okay, so there can be male influence and there can be female influence. There are societies that are matrilineal or patrilineal. That is, your identity is traced either through your mother or your father's lines. All of these things are true. It's the rich and kind of exciting variation in the human species. But as you pointed out yourself, influence is not dominance, and influence can be shared. In fact, the healthiest societies recognize difference, and they create structures by which that difference does not become dominance. It's just, unfortunately, from my point of view, at one point in human history, that gender role differentiation, the differentiation between male and female, hardened from difference into dominance. And we've been living with the consequences of that ever since.
Interesting response. So we're still on the topic of patriarchy. It's a bit complicated, but I'm going to ask you a question similar to patriarchy, but also related to matriarchy. Were original societies matriarchal? Is this a topic that you have been studying over the years?
I can claim no expertise in this, but from my reading of sources, if matriarchy is defined as the mirror opposite of patriarchy, that is, a society with institutionalized female dominance, no, then there's never been matriarchy. There's no record or no hint that there have been societies where women dominated men in the way that men today dominate women. So if matriarchy, however, means female-centered societies, or societies that I said were matrilineal, sure, but that's just part of the incredible variation in human societies. This is where I think we have to be cautious about trying to read too much into prehistory. you can find, for instance, objects that appear to be venerating goddesses, not gods. Okay, well, what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that it might be females had a central role in the origin myths of societies, which is hardly surprising since women give birth. It wouldn't be surprising that there were societies where the role of women was central. After all, in that sense, women are life-giving. Of course, they can't do it without men, but these are questions that are interesting. I'm not sure we'll ever have answers to them, but matriarchy and patriarchy as mirror opposites. No, there was no matriarchy in that sense.
I do agree. There's a writer called Cynthia Eller. She's somewhat of an expert on the myth of matriarchies in prehistory.
Yeah. And you can understand why, people want all sorts of things to be true, right? So if you're in a patriarchal society, it's not surprising that some people want to imagine there was a time when women ran everything. But what we want and what might be an accurate account of history often diverge, unfortunately. And in fact, too much of the conflict in the world comes when what we want to be true, unfortunately, is not an accurate account of the human experience. That's what keeps white supremacy alive today, that the desire for the belief in the inherent superiority of people connected to the European continent, right? That desire for white supremacy to be true can override the evidence that in fact it is not. And it can lead to really pathological behavior, which we're seeing all around us today, unfortunately.
Cynthia's article is titled Sons of the Mother, Victorian Anthropologists and the Myth of Matriarchal Prehistory.
Yeah.
Yeah, I read it some years ago. And if you want to, if you didn't read it before, you should go and read it. It's quite balanced.
Yeah, she has a book that came out later that I've read also. So.
Oh, okay. I don't know. I figured that you were familiar with Cynthia. Maybe I wasn't pronouncing her name right.
Yeah, but you have to remember, Lipton, I am 63 years old, and books I read 20 years ago, I might not be able to recall very exactly. So you have to have a little a leeway for those of us with aging memories.
All right, but you're doing well. Once I like talking about him. So I interviewed Jeffrey Williamson some time ago. If you don't remember, Jeffrey Williamson is a former star economist. He's in his 80s now, so he's not working. And during the interview, he remembered the papers that he wrote years ago without looking at them because there are some challenges, and that was really impressive. I was trying to keep up with him.
Yes.
Yeah, and he's in his 80s, so he's really impressive. So you may get lucky to and become like Jeffrey.
Well, one of the things I've learned after I spent about 30 years in academic life, 4 years in a PhD program and 26 years teaching at the University of Texas. And there was a lot I became cynical about professional intellectuals, but it was balanced by exposure to a lot of extraordinary minds, people much smarter than I, deeper thinkers. And that was a great experience. It reminds me that, there are different kinds of intellects and different contributions people can make. I'm well aware that I'm never the smartest guy in the room, but I also know that I have an ability to speak clearly and plainly, that I can sometimes try to summarize complex ideas in a way that ordinary people and my students could understand. And so even though I've never been under the illusion that I'm that bright, we all have certain kinds of talents and gifts to offer, not only in building the world literally, physically, but intellectually as well, as we come to understand. And so I have a lot of respect for professional academics and the contributions they've made, but I also realize that everybody I've ever met can contribute to that intellectual conversation if given the opportunity. And I think that's really important.
If given the opportunity, you're correct again, but I prefer intellectual substance to style. And unfortunately, today we're living in a world where style is too important. So
Yeah.
obviously you're an experienced guy, you have done several interviews. And if you're paying attention to this interview, it's quite clear that I'm not trying to be political. I prefer substance to style. I
Sure.
don't care about how people feel. And these days I'm overwhelmed with feelings and
Yeah.
emotions. I prefer the data. So we started discussion talking about
Yeah.
patriarchy. Patriarchy could have a biological origin. Some academics argue that political preferences are heritable and not all preferences are
Yeah.
good. So if patriarchy is biological, this does not logically us we should not therefore logically assume that patriarchy is beneficial.
Absolutely. I mean, there's lots of things beings do that are incredibly destructive. We mentioned the capacity for violence. I mean, I think of myself as a non-violent person. That's largely because probably when I was a kid, I was so small and skinny, I knew I was never going to fare too well if I made my way in the world by fighting. But I know also I'm capable of violence, just like every other human being. And not only capable of violence, but capable of brutality. I mean, if the last few thousand years of history teaches us anything, it's of the potential depravity of the human being. All right, well, that's biological. I mean, it's not just, an occasional, oddball who's capable of violence. It's every one of us. And that brutality is spread widely enough through human history that it would be not only arrogant, but ridiculous to assume it's only some people who have it. And so you're absolutely right. There are all sorts of things that are biological in the sense that we are capable, that human nature has the range where we could express such things, but they're incredibly destructive. And that's why certain kinds of social customs are in place to try to contain the worst of our nature. And human nature, there's two things about human nature that are clear. It's plastic, as the neuroscientists say. That is, it can change over time, right, in an individual. And it's also widely variable, right? We see every kind of human behavior possible. We see nonviolent people who will lay down their own lives to try to protect others. And we see sociopaths who will take another life without thought. Well, that's all biological in a sense. It's all within our capacity. And so we try to curb the worst of it and try to foster the best of those instincts to produce a society that we want to live in, one that's, I would say, characterized by three things. One is a belief in the inherent dignity of all people, that everybody born on the planet comes into this world with the same claim to dignity. The need for solidarity, that human beings are a social animal, and except for the occasional hermit, we all need to live in communities that value us. And I would say also a kind of rough equality to make dignity and solidarity possible. Well, those are what I would say are the values we want to foster. And to do that, sometimes we have to repress the worst of our nature.
Robert, so I am thinking about the history of human society and patriarchy. We do know that violence in hunter-gatherer societies for a long time was underestimated, and modern research shows that hunter-gatherer societies have a modest level of inequality, and the matriarchal history, that's a myth. So patriarchy is recently if patriarchy is recent in human history, how were early societies structured in terms of equality? This is just a question that I am posing.
Yeah. Well, here, I think, again, we always have to begin by saying there's incredible variation, because there's incredible variation in the landscapes on which human beings have lived and evolved. Right. So you wouldn't expect a society in, I live in New Mexico now, in the mountains of New Mexico, to have evolved in the same way as it did in the forests of Europe or in the savanna of Africa. So there's incredible variation in human societies, but this is something people will debate, but I do believe that prior to agriculture, the human societies tended toward the more egalitarian. Now, it doesn't mean there weren't human societies where there weren't institutionalized hierarchies. For instance, I was reading about some societies in the Pacific Northwest of the US where there were rich salmon runs which were sometimes hereditary. That is, one family would control a particular run. Well, that could lead to one family having more resources, and it could lead to hierarchy. So these things do happen, but in general, the pattern, and with human history, we're always trying to look at patterns, and there are always exceptions to those patterns, but the patterns are what matter, right? And I think we can see that pre-agriculture, right, human societies were smaller, they were more egalitarian, and that's connected to the inability to store surpluses that would make questions of ownership so central. You know, we talk about owning things today as if it's normal. Well, there are societies in which the concept of kind of individual ownership of things wouldn't make much sense, and especially not the ownership of land. I mean, this is one of the truly crazy things about the last few thousand years, the idea that people own different parts of the earth. Well, you know, there's an old quip, I'm not sure its origins, that if you're smart, you realize we don't own the earth owns us, because eventually we go back to it, right? But you can see societies where the concepts of ownership that we take for granted simply don't exist. And that's a society that's bound to be more egalitarian than the ones we live in today, or the ones we've lived in for the last few thousand years post-agriculture.
The concept of the individual is also fairly recent.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in African history for a number of reasons, and they will me, like many other empires in Africa, did not have did not appreciate the concept of individual freedom and autonomy. And in the Benin Empire, the Oba was not just the ruler of Benin, but basically the ruler of the world, and the Benis of Benin emphasized collective responsibility. The individual was sacrificed for the collective good. If you committed crimes, you were charged, and also your family members, because of collective responsibility. Individual agency was not emphasized. That's one of the individualism is one of the unique peculiarities of the West.
Yeah, I agree. And it's as you're pointing out, the concept of the individual as the fundamental unit of analysis, right? That everything starts with individuals, is a little weird if you look at the scope of human history. You know, there's a famous quote by Margaret Thatcher, the late Prime Minister of Great Britain, who in the late 70s and 1980s dominated British politics. And she once famously said, "There is no such thing as society. There are only individuals and families." Right? It was kind of a hyper, I would say hyper kind of loony version of what you're talking about. So, you know, I think your point leads to a simple question. How did human beings come to be the dominant species on the planet? Well, it wasn't through individual accomplishment, right? It's not through some Ayn Rand mythology. It's through collective and collaborative work that human beings came to dominate the ecosystems in which they lived because of their capacity for collaboration, cooperation, and to divide labor up. We are a social species that way, in the same way that some insects like ants are, right? Well, that allowed us to dominate the world. And so the mythology of the contemporary capitalist world, that the world is built by individuals, is crazy on two levels. One is it's not true. The world was not built by individuals. And number two, as you're pointing out, the whole concept of the individual is a fairly recent phenomenon. Now, it's one that's championed by people who want to profit off of that idea. And so in capitalism, there's a kind of cult around the individual. And I think that's one of the things to battle. Now, here's why the world is complex. At the same time, we live in societies with governments that concentrate a lot of power, and societies with corporations that concentrate a lot of power. And sometimes the idea of individual rights, like, you know, I studied freedom of expression and the First Amendment to the US Constitution and taught those subjects. And so the right of the individual to express oneself is important given the current distribution of wealth and power in the world. But if I could live in a world where nobody even thought about free expression for the individual because there was a functioning collective, I'd be quite happy. But that's not the world we live in. So we're sort of stuck now trying to protect certain kinds of individual rights, even though as you're pointing out, the concept of the individual is a little weird in the first place.
But Robert, according to the empirical data, individualism as a cultural variable correlates positively with many favorable outcomes like governance, institutional quality, and innovation. And as a champion of free speech, I doubt that you would want to live in a world where people are not allowed to express themselves.
Absolutely. That's what I said. It's complex. Now, you also have to recognize, so let's take what we typically call the developed world, the global north, the first world. They score very high, these countries, on a lot of these measures you're talking about. Well, is that because there's a particular philosophy about the individual there? Or is it because for most of the last 500 years of human history, it was those nations that had the power and used the power to acquire a disproportionate share of the world's wealth, to build societies with high levels of education? In other words, the landscape we live on today, the differences between North and South, between first and third world, whatever term you want to use, right? They're not just the product of a certain way of thinking about the world or thinking about humans. They're a product of the accumulation of wealth, typically through extraordinary levels of violence. I mean, the history of the empires of Europe is well documented, and it's one of the particularly ugly phases of human history, full of brutality up to and including acts of genocide, which is I always say it's important to remember that genocide isn't just a synonym for killing a lot of people. Genocide is a specific term, it comes out of the post-World War II era, but it's a specific term that means an attempt to eliminate a group of people as an identifiable people. And much of European history is, in fact, going around the world, acts of genocide to aggrandize the wealth and power of Europe. Okay, that's the way the world map looks today. And as you're pointing out, we want to protect the concept of individual freedom and freedom of expression. But we should do it with an awareness of why the world looks the way it does.
And remember, Robert, individualism is not a proxy for selfishness. People often conflate individualism with selfishness. So if you live in an individualistic society, you're going to extend respect to even those who fall in groups beyond the immediate kin. So individualism is more of a favorable trait than an unfavorable one. And this is one of the reasons why some researchers say that individualistic societies are less corrupt, because they extend, well, you can go ahead and critique the research.
No, finish.
This is one of the reasons why individualistic societies are less corrupt, because they extend trust to people outside of the immediate group and respect.
Well, they don't in all cases, of course. And even within a society in which individuals, let's say a society that has the rule of law and some notion of, acceptance of a system of justice, well, you see all sorts of ways in which certain groups are not accorded that. That individualism itself plays out differently in different places. You can have someone who is individualistic and treats, let's say, just for the sake of argument here, all racial groups equally. Well, you can also have someone who's individualistic and does not do that. It's true that individualism and selfishness are two different things, but we also have to recognize that certain kinds of social and economic systems promote self-interest, promote greed, promote selfishness. In fact, capitalism not only promotes that, but celebrates it. That's, in fact, if there's a moral argument for capitalism, and I don't think there is, but if there is, the attempt that's made is to say, listen, human greed, selfishness is part of human nature, which I agree it is. Everybody understands that. Every human being has the capacity to be selfish. But capitalism says if we foster that selfishness, right? If we unleash that kind of sense of greed, it will lead to productivity that improves the lives of everyone. If there's a moral argument for capitalism, that's it. I just think it's an argument that fails because, of course, it doesn't benefit everyone. And in fact, capitalism in its history has essentially depended on the immiseration of a significant portion of the world's population. So it's, you know, it's the Adam Smith argument that if you let loose the forces of selfishness and greed, you'll get societal benefits. Has it played out? No, I don't think so. But we should remember that even Adam Smith was worried about that. Adam Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations, is the one everybody quotes. This greed and self-interest can get out of hand. And he basically said anybody who lets that run their life is not fully human. And he said there had to be checks on that greed. So, you know, it's one of those great moments where you realize that a complex thinker in a previous age, somebody like Adam Smith, is quoted selectively depending on whether you want to justify the capitalist system or not. But his own writing is in fact much more sophisticated and nuanced than you'll see quoted in the average business school or economics department.
The theory of moral sentiment. So for a while you were breaking up, and yes, Adam Smith was a moral philosopher. Always remember that. He was a moral philosopher, was making an ethical and moral case for capitalism. There's a writer, Virgil Store. I'm fond of his work. If you're unfamiliar with Virgil, you should check him out. He has written extensively on the morality of capitalism, and they've also written on the topic for a public audience. Robert, what do you mean by capitalism? Because when I invoke the term capitalism, I'm referring to economic freedom. And economic freedom correlates positively with well-being, and there's actually a negative relationship between economic freedom and inequality. When I say capitalism, I mean you should get rid of all privileges and create a level playing field. So what do you mean by capitalism? I want you to be specific.
By capitalism, I mean the system that actually exists in the world, not that exists in theory. So a capitalist system, and here, you know, one of the things that's interesting about historians and economists is there is no single simple definition of capitalism that everybody agrees on, nor does everybody agree at what point it started. You know, capitalism is either 250 years old or 400 years old or 500 years old, depending on how who you read. But let's just say that the description of a capitalist system that has existed in the world has, of course, been about private ownership, especially private ownership of the means of production. It has meant that a significant portion of the world's population is reduced to what we call wage labor, where you sell your time to an employer to acquire the means by which you live. And of course, the history of capitalism is the history of imperialism and brutality. You can't separate the two. The wealth of capitalist states in Europe, right, was not produced in Europe alone. It was produced also in the global South, you know, the Americas, Asia, Africa. And that wasn't produced by any capitalist principle. That was produced by sheer power. So, you know, what some people call primitive accumulation, the accumulation of the wealth that made Europe the wealthiest, and Europe and its offshoots, the United States, Australia, places like that, Canada, right? None of that proceeded along capitalist principles. It proceeded along the anti-principle of brutality to acquire resources and exploit the labor of others. So when I say capitalism, I mean the system that actually exists, which has never created a level playing field. Certainly not worldwide, but not even within specific societies. And here's the point I would make, is even if capitalism did, I wouldn't want to live in a capitalist economy. I wouldn't want to live in an economy where people treat each other in the way that capitalism demands they treat each other. That is, as means to an end, not as fully human. Now, the question might be, if capitalism is so bad, why is there even still a world? Why didn't capitalism destroy itself? And here I think we have to realize that human beings are more than their economic system. So capitalism tells you, treat other people as simply a means to an end to aggrandize your own wealth and power. But people have a hard time doing that because people are more complex. And so you have cultural traditions and religious traditions that in fact tell people the opposite, that don't treat people like that, treat people like your brother and sister, right? And so it's particularly, I think, ironic that the Christian tradition, which is the dominant tradition out of Europe, of course, which has as a core belief that we are all equal, that you treat each other as you would want yourself to be treated. It's what we sometimes call the golden rule or the ethic of reciprocity. And it's at the core of not only Christianity, but most of the world's faith traditions, right? That exists in so-called Christian America, right alongside capitalism, which tells you to behave exactly the opposite. And the only reason capitalism hasn't destroyed itself is because those other bonds between people, which are nurtured by traditions, especially faith traditions, right, keep us from being the barbaric individuals that capitalism tells us to be. We're just too complex. We're not quite that depraved yet.
Well, capitalism needs moral tradition, Robert. So on this angle, I'm going to divert a bit. So you're right on the point of early European capitalism. Even scholars who call themselves free market economists do agree that Europeans practice mercantilism, the navigation acts were protectionist, but capitalism needs trust and sentiment to survive. As you said, humans are complicated creatures. So if you're a true capitalist, you're going to respect your workers and people.
Right. No, there's no reason to observe that because, in fact, capitalists have long made money by not respecting workers. Now you can make your way in a capitalist world as an owner and try to accord workers some level of dignity, but it's not required by the system. And in fact, people profit quite handsomely by exploiting workers. I mean, you just go back to the early factory system where human beings were treated in ways that we would now see as barbaric. But then look at some of the practices today in capitalism. I mean, look at the kind of sweatshop conditions that are the norm in some parts of the world. And just think about the average office. Think about the average data processing center. Capitalists maximize profit by treating workers in a data processing center as machines. Well, that's not according them dignity. Amazon has taken a lot of hit. Amazon.com has taken a lot of hits for this because of the way they run their warehouses. And they should be criticized for the way they treat workers with no dignity and, in fact, exposure to repetitive strain injuries. I mean, these are all, true of Amazon warehouses, but they're true of capitalism more generally. It doesn't mean that every single person who's ever owned a business in capitalism has been a monster. It means that capitalism rewards people who are monsters, and therefore the quest to always expand and generate profit is going to mean that monstrous behavior is the norm in capitalism. It's not an exception. It's the inevitable workings of the system. And when a system can be predicted to work in a way that undermines human dignity, then I think we should abandon the system. Now, with capitalism, you have another reason to abandon it, which is, of course, it's ecological suicide at this point to continue mass consumption capitalist economics. So it's not only that some individuals within the human species are denigrated in capitalism, it's that we're about to, render the ecosystems of the world unable to sustain large-scale human societies, which means at that point, even bankers at Goldman Sachs are going to be in trouble, because when we get to that point, holding a lot of wealth in financial instruments isn't going to mean much. So capitalism is both inhuman, but it's also ecocidal. It's not the only economic system that can destroy ecosystems. Others have in history, but it's the one we're dealing with today. That's why I've said over and over that capitalism at this point is a kind of death cult, that an embrace of capitalism is an embrace of the acceleration of the destruction of ecosystems that will leave eventually the planet unable to sustain large-scale human life as we know it.
Interesting take. So but back to the issue of employers and workers. Do you know what the primary cause that often results in people exiting the job market, their jobs, having working in a toxic workplace. So I get your point that people can make serious money if they don't treat their workers
Mhm.
well. But the evidence also shows that in these organizations, workers are less productive and it is not a feasible long-term strategy.
Well, it has been a feasible long term. I mean, just look at the look at the state of California, the agricultural powerhouse of America. Well, that's has existed on immigrant labor, largely undocumented immigrant labor, for a long time. Often those immigrant workers are subjected to high levels of chemical toxicity because of the nature of modern farming. They are not paid anything like what we would call a living wage. They're housed under conditions that are reprehensible. In some places, you have actually what is equivalent to slave labor. This has been documented in the state of Florida, where immigrants are come in, their passports are confiscated by the contractor running the labor gangs, and they live in essentially slave-like conditions with virtually no avenue for improving those conditions, with one exception, and that's, of course, unionizing and drawing on social movements who want to support them. So it's true that capitalists could make money, especially over the long term, by treating workers with dignity. But it's also true you can make a whole lot of money in the short term. And the short term, we're not just talking about, the next month, we're talking about years and years, decades and decades. You can make a lot of money by completely ignoring the humanity of workers. But beyond that, there's a bigger question: is why should there be workers and owners in the first place? As I said, the human species came to dominate the planet through its capacity for collaboration and cooperation in systems that were largely egalitarian. Well, there's no reason we can't do that again. There's no reason there has to be a boss. I would love to live in a world where there were no bosses. Now, that
I
doesn't.
know why I'm laughing. I know why I'm laughing. The late E.O. Wilson, who died. Do you remember what
Yeah,
he said about capitalism and socialism?
no, I do not.
The human species is just too selfish to live in a world where we're all equal. He said something to
That,
that effect. It was a bit witty though.
yeah, and he was in fact wrong about that because he had a very limited sense of the human species. He didn't think about apparently the 300,000 years of Homo sapien, the large majority of which were lived in conditions that were egalitarian. So when people say human beings can't do that, you have to explain why human beings did it for so long. Now, I want to be clear, I'm realistic. I'm not some naive, pie in the sky fellow who thinks that people are now magically going to all start living together in peace and harmony if we just, abolish capitalism. We're stuck in a world in which these hierarchies have produced habits, ways of living that can't just be reversed overnight. If they could, they would have been by now, I think. Right. So I think we can both recognize that the domination subordination dynamic of whether it's capitalism or patriarchy or anything is not the only way people can live. But I also think it is correct that once those systems are in place, they have a force that is not easily overturned. Right. So, take patriarchy. Thousands of years of institutionalized male dominance is not going to be overturned overnight. And the feminist movement understands that. Right. We're talking about not only decades, not only generations, we're talking about centuries or perhaps millennia if the human species survives that long. I certainly am not naive. I know that in my lifetime, I will not see the end of capitalism. I will not see the end of patriarchy. I will not see the end of white supremacy. I will not see the end of first world dominance through imperialism. Right? That's just a given. But the question is not, can the world be overturned overnight? The question is, what do I, as a moral agent, somebody who takes seriously my moral responsibility to principles that I've already mentioned around dignity, solidarity, and equality, what's my obligation to try to push that process forward? And my individual contribution will be very small, as everybody's individual contribution will be. But it's because people in previous generations were not naive. but contributed to the social movements that made the world a better place, well, that's why it's possible to make progress. I always use, when people say, either nothing can happen or everything's fine now, I always think about my own lifetime. I was born in 1958, right? In 1958, the United States was an apartheid society, right? The historic injustices that came out of white supremacy were still very palpable. In some states, there was no citizenship for people of African descent in any meaningful way, right? Well, the world is a better place today than it was in 1958. We still have lots of problems to uproot, and I think change complex and nuanced expressions of white supremacy. But we can also realize the world is a better place. Well, how did the world get to be a better place? It wasn't because white people woke up one day and got a conscience. It wasn't because white people started deciding, oh, white supremacy, that might be a bad idea. We got the progress we got because people of color organized, drawing on the assistance of some white people of conscience, but they took it upon themselves to do that work. Now, they didn't naively think it was all going to change overnight. In fact, there have been important people who pushed forward racial justice in the United States who never saw that progress in their own lifetime. If you think about the early 20th century, the opponents of lynching, for instance, well, many of them worked hard to try and highlight the problem of lynching, to try and get legislation against it. And they died before they saw any success, but their lives were not irrelevant. They laid the groundwork for the later civil rights movement and more radical ideas. So, this is just, the complexity of being human in systems that are structured on domination and subordination. One has to have principles, but one doesn't have to be naive.
All right. So, Robert, throughout the conversation, you have been mentioning imperialism and white people. And I am Black, Robert. I'm a Black person living in Jamaica. Politically, I identify as a libertarian, and I am a student of history, empires, and imperial history. And you have been assaulting white people. I have no animus whatsoever towards white people. So you have been criticizing white people and European imperialism. But imperialism is not unique to whites. Imperialism, exactly, empire building, slavery, ethnocentrism, racism, all of these traits have actually been the norm in many societies. In several indigenous societies, for instance, people are ethnocentric. So in one society, I don't remember the name of the society, but Thomas Woods wrote a book and he cited this scholar, and the scholar listed the indigenous society. But in one indigenous society, the word that represents that culture actually means we are the real people. And in various West African pre-colonial societies, the word for the national country was translated into real people. We are real. We're the true people. So Europeans are not the only people who have imposed their cultures on others. They're not the only people who have slaughtered innocents. So I don't have a problem with criticizing imperialism. Edmund Burke and other Western philosophers critique imperialism. So I'm not bashing you for doing so, but I'm just wondering, why are you so hard on whites?
Well, I'm not hard on whites in any particular way. I'm trying to be morally accountable for the world in which I live. So let's take, you can go back to the Roman Empire, incredibly brutal, right? Vicious.
It was very brutal.
Okay, right. Well, I don't live in the Roman Empire. I live in the contemporary United States. All right. So my moral responsibility, I can critique the Roman Empire if you want to, or critique, Chinese empires and the brutality of it. That's all fine. And historically, it's interesting and important to understand the scope of human history. But when we talk about political and moral accountability, well, that's, primarily where we live, where one lives. And I live in the United States. And so the United States is the wealthiest and most powerful country in the history of the world. The wealth of the United States is extraordinary. And so it's morally incumbent upon me to ask, where did that wealth come from? right? And there's a story in the United States. It's about hardworking immigrants who came to settle a largely unpopulated land, right? That's the story I grew up with because I'm old enough to have been educated before social movements started demanding a more accurate account of US history. But that's not how the wealth of this country was accumulated. So my responsibility, I don't feel guilty. Let's take the near complete genocide of indigenous populations in the continental United States. I'm not responsible for that in the sense that I should feel guilty. I wasn't alive when it happened. And it's just a kind of moral truism. You can't be responsible for something you have no control over. Right? You can't be responsible for something that happened before you were born. What I am responsible for is the current design of the system and power and my role in that. So I have no animus toward white people. I don't hate myself. I don't hate people who are white. Right? I do have a sharp critique of both the current and the historical system that led to this. Now, I don't know why that is inconsistent with recognizing there have been other systems of domination and subordination throughout post-agricultural history. That's true enough. But you can think about this on an individual level. There's a lot of bad people. I live in northern New Mexico, and I can find any number of people doing bad things, and I can criticize them, and that's fine. But my primary moral responsibility is for my own actions, right? Just as culturally, my primary responsibility as a member of a culture is to understand and try to rectify the injustice that comes as a predictable result of the system I live in. So I both agree with you, but don't see why that is at odds with being someone who is white in traditional terms, the way we use terms like white and black, who has had a number of advantages growing up in a wealthy and powerful country that drew a lot of that wealth through violence, and now still has a system which distributes that wealth and power in ways that I think are morally unacceptable. So it's not to say the United States is unique in human history. It's to say I live in the United States. That's where my moral responsibility lies.
Okay, and if you wish, and I think you're going to do so, so Robert, these days I've been doing shorter shows. So you were talking about colonialism and capitalism and the environment. So I have an article on the relationship between capitalism and the environment, but I'm not going to talk about this article. I can send you the link and you can read it. We have to move on. The conversation is too interesting, too many things to discuss. I would actually plan to talk to you about pornography.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, but I like economic discussion. So in relation to American history and brutality, Trevor Bernard, I interviewed him recently, and Trevor Bernard and his co-author, they have an excellent paper criticizing the new history of capitalism. And Charles Post, a man of the left, he also has an excellent paper criticizing NHC. So you can go and look them up if you haven't done so already. But we can't discuss the new history of capitalism now. That's going to take up too much time. So we're going to talk about pornography.
Okay.
But before we talk about pornography, have you been following the NHC school?
Well, I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that. There is
New history
a
of
lot of work.
New economic history of capitalism on cotton.
Yeah, the work on slavery, the role of slavery, and all of that's very interesting and I think very compelling. And I think what's important about it is it kind of documents which most of us already knew, that the history of the expansion of the United States wealth and power was dramatically connected to cotton. Cotton was not only the raw material for the mills of New England, it was also the source of a lot of the hard capital of the industrializing United States. So these things, historians and economists argue about a lot of things, but I try to focus on the broad outlines of history and what we know and we can all agree on. And what we can agree is contrary to even minimal moral principles. And from that, I think we have to reckon with the distribution of wealth and power that we see in contemporary capitalism in the United States. But You said you wanted to move on to pornography, so
Yes, I
let's
want
go.
to move on to pornography, but maybe, Robert, maybe I should do a written interview. That's what I'm going to do at some point in the future, because there are just so many issues to talk about. Pornography, Robert. Wendy
Uh-huh.
McElroy, a libertarian, she has criticized feminists who critique pornography. What's your objection to pornography?
Uh, well, pornography, first of all, we need to put it in the context of what I would call the sexual exploitation industries more generally. Prostitution, pornography, massage parlors, stripping. What are these? These are ways that primarily men buy and sell objectified female bodies for sexual pleasure. I think such a system is inconsistent with any minimal conception of humanity. I think such a system is a serious impediment to the critique of patriarchy and the attempt to create a just society. Right now, if you look at the practice of buying and selling bodies for sex, I think is inconsistent with any moral system I can imagine wanting to endorse. Now, the question of pornography more specifically requires us to talk about how are these images made, what do these images look like, and how are they used? In other words, we would look at the production process, the actual content of pornography, and how the primarily male consumers use that pornography. And when we do that, and this is work that really began in the late 60s, the 1970s, by the wing of feminism that's typically called radical feminism. That's the branch of feminism I most identify with. Well, they've demonstrated that not only in pornography, but the sexual exploitation industries more generally, that they are extremely dangerous for women, both psychologically and physically. That is, women are injured in the production of pornography as well as the other sexual exploitation industries. If you look at the actual content, what pornography primarily does is sexualize male dominance and other forms of hierarchy, especially racism. Pornography is not only a relentlessly sexist and misogynist genre, it's also without question the most overtly racist media genre in the world. Right? And then you have to ask, how do men use pornography? Does it facilitate a healthy sexuality? Does it facilitate greater communication between men and women? And the data there is equally clear that it does not. So I oppose pornography for the effects it has in the world. And I understand that people with a more libertarian bent, they downplay those effects because the supreme value is individual choice. Okay, I think that's the wrong way to balance those questions. But it's interesting that the feminist critique of pornography that I work from, which, as I said, grew out of the radical feminism of the 1960s, was well established by the late 70s and early 80s, right? It predicted a certain dynamic. And what we can see in the last 30, 40 years of history is that the radical feminist critique has been extremely accurate in the intensification of that misogyny and racism in pornography, right? That as pornography has become more mainstream, as technology has allowed its distribution more widely, the worst aspects of pornographic images, right? That sexualizing of brutality, that sexualizing of inequality, have intensified in ways that I don't think anybody could have imagined. And the consequences both for the women used in the production of pornography, as well as the consequences for women who are dealing with men who use pornography, I think at this point, I actually think it's kind of an open and shut case that pornography is detrimental to human flourishing. And I continue to believe that and continue to write and try to act organized toward that end.
2 points. Pornography, consuming a moderate amount of pornography is not shrinking the brain. Pornography is not making men rapists, but I do agree with your argument in relation to the exploitation of actors. So for instance, prostitution. Many prostitutes don't want to be prostitutes, and unfortunately, too many of them are exploited. And we don't speak enough about this, but in early Christianity, the church was against prostitution because the prostitutes were victims. They did not want to be prostitutes. So I don't agree with people who who celebrate prostitution like it's a form of empowerment. Many prostitutes don't want to be prostitutes.
I agree, but I would contest, I agree with you on that, but the effects on male consumers are not as harmless as you suggest.
I didn't say this was harmless. I didn't say it was harmless. I said that it's not shrinking the brain.
Well, media doesn't shrink. Shrinking the brain isn't a really meaningful phrase, nor does it make men rapists, but that has never been the argument of the feminist movement. It's not that pornography makes men rape, right? That there's some simplistic causal relationship. Man watches porn, man becomes rapist. Men rape at epidemic levels, that's true enough. And the question is, what does especially the habitual consumption of pornography, which sexualizes domination and sexualizes male power, how does that create conditions in which rape becomes more inviting? How does that not only affect rape, but how does it affect what we might call, quote unquote, normal sexual interaction in a consensual relationship? Well, the evidence here is quite clear that men do learn from pornography. Again, it's not robotic. It doesn't mean that a man watches pornography and wants to do everything he sees in a pornographic video. But the reports from both women and men, as well as some experimental data, suggest that pornography does have an effect and creates a sort of sexual ethic, you could say, that normalizes not only violence, but normalizes what we would call cruel and degrading treatment of women. And men increasingly testify that themselves. I've talked to, I can't think of how many hundreds of men I've talked to now in my career who say, I find that my use of pornography makes it hard for me to treat women in a fully human way. So men themselves are reporting this. Now, from one perspective, this is a serious problem, a feminist perspective, I would say, from a human perspective. But large parts of the left, and here I'm very critical of the left, political left of which I'm a part, large parts of the left have ignored this because I think large parts of the left simply don't care about a critique of patriarchy. And many left men are much more worried about continued sexual access to women than they are about justice around sex and gender.
Your point about men who engage porn view women is correct in the sense that men who consume porn in relation to rape, they select sentences that are not as punitive. So even, well, you may go ahead because it appears that you are going to say something, but you may go ahead.
Well, there's a lot of experimental data. It's been going on for 40 years now, and it's sometimes contradictory. People read the data differently. As I said, I try to focus on what I think we can all agree on, right? And here's the way I would say it. We know that human beings are a storytelling species, right? That's what we do. We tell stories, right? And so storytelling is very important in how human beings come to understand the world. It's how our attitudes are formed. It's largely, or at least partially, and I would say largely affected by the way society tells stories. All right, and we know that our attitudes affect the way we behave. All right, now, when you inundate a society with pornographic images that say women are less than men, women are objects to further the sexual pleasure of men, that doesn't mean that it has a direct effect on male behavior in a kind of one-to-one correspondence. It means that if you saturate a society with those stories, it will affect attitudes, and those attitudes will affect behavior. If anybody doubts that, ask yourself a simple question. Why do American businesses spend hundreds of billions of dollars a year on advertising? Well, advertising is a form of storytelling. Well, it doesn't mean that everybody who sees a Coca-Cola ad marches out robotically to buy a Coca-Cola. But advertisers know that the stories affect attitudes and attitudes affect behavior. And they wouldn't spend hundreds of billions of dollars a year if it didn't have some effect. So we know that media storytelling, mediated storytelling, affects human behavior. And to pretend that and I'm not saying you're pretending, but liberals and the left and libertarians largely pretend that somehow this storytelling in pornography doesn't have effects on human behavior, I think is incredibly naive.
Well, Robert, although I'm a libertarian, I'm also Christian. I'm a bit of a paradox. I'm a Christian libertarian who hates identity politics, but I can appreciate various forms of nationalism. Yeah, I prefer to be driven by the data. I don't get too emotionally invested in ideas. I love ideas, but they're not going to rule my life or affect how I treat people. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
The transgender movement. You're also a critic of the transgender movement. I am not a feminist. I'm actually a critic of feminists, of feminism, but I agree with feminists. Gender quotas. If gender quotas are created to benefit women, trans men can get gender quotas, but trans men do not have the history of oppression and discrimination like some women. So I cannot support the trans movement. If you're a true feminist, you can't support men depriving women of benefits.
Yeah. So first of all, it's important to realize there's a sharp debate within feminism. There is not a single feminist approach. As I said, I identify with the radical feminist movement, which has been critical of not of people who struggle with gender dysphoria, but
that's
critical,
a different issue.
Right, but critical of the ideology behind the transgender movement. And I would say that the transgender movement as it currently exists is both intellectually incoherent, that is, the claims they make don't make a lot of sense. And I also think it's politically regressive in the sense that you just said, that the fight against patriarchy, women's struggle to challenge institutionalized male dominance, is not advanced when men can self-identify and enter women's spaces, whether it's a women's locker room, whether it's competing in girls and women's athletics, whether it's vying for a scholarship set aside for women to try to address historic injustice. So I agree. I think there is a way to deal with the way people often feel uncomfortable with what I would call the rigid, repressive, and regressive gender norms in patriarchy. And I am a critic of those gender norms. The idea that men are tough and women are soft, that men don't cry and women are more emotional, the idea that women are more naturally suited for certain kinds of work than men. Those are very rigid gender norms. That is, they're very hard to break out of in patriarchy. They're very repressive in that they keep individuals, both men and women, from experiencing their full potential. And they're regressive in the political sense. They deepen patriarchy's hold on us. So I think one can criticize gender norms without embracing any of the claims of the transgender movement. And I, in fact, think that people who suffer from gender dysphoria, that is, who have some psychological discomfort with their own bodies and what they would describe as a disjuncture between their subjective internal experience of a gender and their biological sex, I think those people would actually be better served by radical feminism than by the current transgender movement. Now, everything I just said would be hotly debated within certain feminist circles. And in fact, everything I just said has gotten me kicked out of certain feminist circles. Ever since I started writing about this issue in 2014, I have been told in no uncertain terms that I'm not welcome in some circles. And a lot of the feminists who've made these critiques, and I want to make it clear, I'm just following again in the argument that radical feminists have been making now, well, basically since the 1970s. The first book critiquing the transgender movement was published in 1979 by an excellent scholar named Janice Raymond. So I'm following in that tradition, and it is not a popular position to take in, not only within certain schools of feminist thought, but it's not a popular position to take in liberal institutions, universities, certain kinds of government institutions. This is one where people say, well, you're conservative. And I say, well, no, I'm not conservative. I'm just trying to make a radical feminist argument consistently in a way that I think is politically productive.
So Robert, again, on this show, we're not polemical, but I'm familiar with your work and I have been listening to your opinions quite thoroughly, and it is obvious that you are a man of the left.
Mhm.
I think that the broader issue in academia is not just bureaucracy or intellectual dishonesty, but there is the actual reality that some people could just be stupid. No, it's some
Well,
could just they could be
yeah,
stupid. You're a
yeah.
man
And
of the left. It's quite obvious.
yeah,
Your views on capitalism and the environment, though these are leftist views. Your views on colonialism are leftist. How can people not see that you're a man of the left?
no, they recognize that, but there's a certain kind of ideological fervor around the transgender movement right now that means any critique of the reigning dogma is reason to push one out of the political circle. And by the way, I agree that people can be stupid. You can be stupid and have been in your life. I don't know you well, but I undoubtedly true. I can be stupid. I have been stupid many times in my life, right? As in fact, everybody has. So it's just a recognition that we all have the capacity to engage in critical thinking, critical self-reflection, and rational thought, and that we're all also emotional creatures, and we are prone to letting our desires overwhelm our capacity for rational thought. There's not a single person on the planet who can't say that about themselves. And so I think that's the reason that we want to practice a kind of intellectual humility. And here I agree with you. Emotions matter in the world. Emotions tell us something. For instance, if somebody treats me badly and I feel angry, that's an emotion, but it tells me something about my reaction to a kind of disregard for my humanity. So it's not that emotions aren't important. It's that emotions themselves are not an argument. And here I think you and I would agree.
Yes.
And I would tell students this often. They would say, well, I feel a certain way. And I would say feelings are relevant to how we come to be human. But feelings in and of themselves do not constitute an argument. In other words, I can't win an argument with you by telling you, well, I feel this way. How I feel might be relevant to how we understand the argument. But feelings, here we're on exactly the same page. And I think what you're pointing to is that in contemporary discourse, there are too many times when an expression of a feeling is confused with an opinion that has been supported by some sort of argument that offers evidence and logic. And I think that is a very distressing point. I taught, for the better part of 30 years and tried to tell students that they should honor their emotions, but then go forward to make arguments. And I also think it's important to realize that reasonable people can come to different conclusions. That was my mantra in one of my classes. Whenever we'd get to a kind of hot point, I would say, step back and say, and remember, reasonable people can disagree because the world is complex beyond the ability of any one person to definitively declare the truth. I think I'm right about the positions I hold, although if presented with an argument, I would and have in my life changed them. I wasn't always a critic of pornography, for instance. When I first started studying the issue, I had traditional libertarian liberal values on it and policy prescriptions. What changed me was the evidence, right? And being able to read and think and work through the evidence. So I apologize for the digression, but I think it's
No,
an
excellent. Excellent
yeah,
summation of a true intellectual.
yeah.
It's just like interviews today. I no longer frequent that space because I recognize that for some people, it's too difficult for them to interview an individual sharing contradictory opinions and then not be disrespectful.
Yeah.
It's just the weirdest thing ever for me because on a daily basis I interview people who don't share my views any at all, and we have a great discussion. Why can't others do the same?
Yeah. Well, I agree with that. I also want to be aware that in some cases, people who are, let's put it, a term that's popular these days, in marginalized groups, take women, for instance, have tried to have principled, logical, evidence-based arguments with men and have been dismissed as being, oh, that's just feminist bullshit or something like that. So, you know, an honest conversation requires that kind of commitment from both parties. And I understand why people get frustrated when they feel the other party is not living up to that arrangement. So, you know, the goal is to try and improve our critical self-reflection, improve our abilities to understand each other. And I agree with you 100%. That is far too uncommon in contemporary, at least in the contemporary United States, which is what I know best.
Robert, so we have been speaking for a while, and throughout the interview, you have criticized patriarchy. But I have a tricky question for you now, Robert. Do you have a problem?
This will have to, not to interrupt, but this will have to be the last one because I've got another commitment. So let's.
Okay, all right.
We'll wind up with a hard question.
Yes,
I like that.
Yes, tricky question. Robert, do you object to patriarchy perpetuating stereotypes that benefit women? So ladies before gentlemen, this is a simple example. If men and women are both equal, why serve women first?
Yeah, well, I think I wrestled with that question, and there's a feminist philosopher named Marilyn Frye who helped me understand it, that most of the ways that women are supposedly benefiting from patriarchy are not benefits at all. So take she used in her article this practice of men holding the door open for women, right? Well, that benefits women. Well, except it really doesn't benefit women. It's a trivial matter. And it also signals that somehow women need the assistant. They can't open their own doors. So is that really beneficial to women? Well, not really. Well, what about the idea that, you know, women can be homemakers and that benefits women because they don't have to go out in the working world? There's a certain truth to that. But it also leaves, in a capitalist economy, women in a sense, at the mercy of their husbands who control the flow of income into the house. So you could say, well, women don't have to work. Yes, but they lose a certain amount of authority, autonomy, power, and the ability to control their own lives. So there are a lot of things that patriarchy allegedly benefits women, where you have to ask, well, is that really a benefit? And wouldn't a more equal society be, in the long run, far more beneficial to women? Let's take the most common one, the idea that women can use their sexual power, that is their attractiveness to men, to get certain things. Well, that's certainly true. Everybody can cite examples where, let's say, a woman who was especially conventionally attractive could get a favor from the boss by flirting. Okay, that's true, right? But is that really in the benefit of women? Well, you have to ask some questions. First of all, who has that kind of power, if you want to call that sexual power? Well, it's most often conventionally attractive women. All women don't have that power. So already you're creating a class division within women. Second is, how long do women have that power? Able to get what they want by flirting, but women will tell you quickly that they age out of that category. Right? I've had women tell me that by the time they're in their late 20s, men no longer look at them the same way. Okay. And third, what kind of power is it? Well, it might be the power to advance your own standing in a company in a short-term way. But is it the power to make decisions over political and economic policy? No, it's a very limited, very sort of self-centered power. So even there, right, it is situations to gain short-term advantages, but that's not to their long-term advantage. And it's certainly not to the advantage of women as a class, because all women don't have access to it. So I think we have to be pretty critical of the ways that people say patriarchy benefits women. And of course, the only way you can really even make that claim is to ignore the endemic violence against women: rape, domestic violence, childhood sexual assault. These are consistent patterns in patriarchal society, not the same in every patriarchal society, but consistent in ways that mean no woman is ever safe in the world. And it's hard to imagine trying to defend a system that means every woman is always unsafe. It doesn't mean every man is going to rape every woman. It doesn't mean every husband is going to beat up every wife. It means women do not have that security. And it's hard to imagine justifying a patriarchal system as in the benefit of women when that reality is the bedrock.
All right, so excellent interview. Last word from me. You are indeed a radical feminist because you perceive women to be autonomous agents. And in this regard, I agree with you. Women are autonomous agents. If a man can work for 10 hours, so can a woman. If a man wants to fight a war, so can a woman. I do have a problem with feminists who belittle women. Women can be just as aggressive as men. And this is why I like and Rand, because of some of her very aggressive qualities. She was never afraid to debate with people and challenge their ideas. And a woman being aggressive and intellectual does not make her unattractive to me.
Well, you won't be surprised that I do not agree with the philosophy of Ayn Rand.
Nothing.
Although this is a good place to end. When I was in my 20s, I read, I think, virtually everything Ayn Rand ever wrote. I was in a kind of libertarian phase of my own intellectual life, and I took it seriously and I found it compelling. But that didn't endure. Eventually, I came to see what I thought were some, profound flaws in her philosophy. Came to see that the consequences of that philosophy were unacceptable. And so I changed. And I think that's the most important thing, is to recognize that what we might believe at one moment to be an absolute truth that we're willing to die for could easily become an idea that we later transcend. It doesn't mean that, nobody has any principles that matter. It doesn't mean we shouldn't fight for what we believe. It does mean, however, we should all have a little intellectual humility. And I think you and I could probably agree there's far too little of that intellectual humility in the world today. So I was able to find something we agree on to go out with.
Yeah, but we have to speak again, Robert. All right, bye.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.